So I'm Sylvia Clark. I'm from the Murraylands and Riverland Landscape Board. I'm a Citizen Science and Community Engagement Project Officer, and I'd just also like to introduce the other people who are here to make tonight work. And we have Callie and her daughter Ember there, who will be in the background letting people in and keeping an eye on people's microphones and things. And we have Maisie as well. Maisie, are you there? Give us a wave. And Maisie will be helping to collate the questions in the chat as well. So I will introduce our wonderful speakers in just a sec. I'd just like to start with a bit of housekeeping while people are talking, because we're going to have quite a number of people joining us tonight. I'm going to ask everyone to turn their microphones off and also their cameras off while the speakers are speaking. And then when we get to question time, you're welcome to turn your cameras back on. And you can either put questions in the chat up the top. If you're not familiar with Teams, up in the top ribbon, there's a little button with the speech bubble that says chat, and you can write your questions in there, and Maisie will keep track of all those questions that are coming in. The other option is you can put your virtual hand up. There's also a raise hand thing there to ask a question, and then you can turn your camera and your microphone on and ask it live. In terms of safety housekeeping, I hope you're all safe where you are at home, and I hope you all know where your nearest toilets are. So I just want to say thank you very much for joining us on this auspicious day, International Bat Appreciation Day, for this webinar, and taking the time on this day just before Easter to join us to pay homage to these wonderful creatures of the night that live around us. And I'm not sure if you can see, but I've actually got bat ears on today. That's how much I appreciate bats, that I actually wore a bat costume all day today. So I hope some of you might have done the same. Some of you might have been to the webinar that Green Adelaide did about the city bats. Well, this one, that was a great webinar. And this one, we're going and talking about bats of the bush this time. The bats that some of the city ones spreading their wings, and others that are more at home in the bush. And to start us off, I just start with an acknowledgement of country, and then I'll let you know who our wonderful speakers are. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the different lands from which we're all meeting and calling in today. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge and respect their deep spiritual and cultural connection to country. I also pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here joining us today. So who are our wonderful speakers? We have two of South Australia's foremost bat experts joining us today. We have Jason Van Wienen, who is an ecologist from Green Adelaide, and he'll be starting off talking to us about South Australia's newest species of bats and the big guys. And then we'll hand over to Kyle Armstrong, who is a research and consultant biologist with the University of Adelaide, and he'll be going to the other end of the scale to the microbats. And no judgment from me on the perfect size. I appreciate them all, from over 500 grams to under 5 grams. They're all amazing. So yeah, as I said, after each one, we'll have 5 minutes. And then after those two have spoken, I'll also give a little talk to show you how much we appreciate the people who appreciate bats. I'll do a little bit of a recap on a citizen science project that we ran about 6 years ago, and a new one that's underway, to show you what can happen when everybody gets involved, and also finish up with a few things that you can do around home to show your appreciation. And then hopefully we're all good to finish on time around 8:30 tonight, South Australian time. So without further ado, I might hand over to Jason, please.
Thanks, Sylvia. Yeah, it's great to be here to talk about bats. Hopefully you can all see my screen. Yeah, so I'm just giving you a bit of an update on the grey-headed flying foxes here in South Australia, and yeah, their trips out across the state. Like to extend my acknowledgement country. I'm calling in from the beautiful Ghana country here in Adelaide. Okie doke. So the flying foxes we have here in South Australia, we have had a couple of different species visit, the little red and the greys, but the greys are the predominant species we have in South Australia at the moment. They're one of the 7 species of flying foxes here in Australia. They're highly social. They aggregate in large colonies, and they're the thing that surprises a lot of people is that the flying foxes we have here in Adelaide are effectively part of the one population. So bats in here in Adelaide, and the ones moving anywhere in South Australia can be in Victoria and Sydney and all over the place within a reasonably short space of time. They're listed species, so they're listed as vulnerable nationally, and that's basically due to concerns over their decline. And the estimate of population size is around 600,000 flying foxes, thereabouts, the grey-headed flying foxes. And it seems like a lot of bats, but they've got a big job distributing fruits and pollinating so many plants out there. So it's whilst it seems like a large number of bats, it's not for the task at hand. Okay, so what are they doing when they're here moving around the landscape? They're obviously, most of their movements are associated with finding food. They predominantly feed on nectar, but they also do get into fruits, eat a bit of foliage. And the ones we see in South Australia are certainly most of the sightings we see or recordings that we get for the flying foxes are in eucalypts. Eucalypts are widespread throughout the state. But they do have favourites. Things like lemon-scented gums and spotted gums are really favoured by the species. But there are also a variety of trees like big ficus, which provide long-term supplies of figs, which they seem to like. Some photos here of them getting into some of the palm fruits there. There's just a range of fruits that they do get into, the lily-pilly fruits and so on. Many people would have heard of them also getting into some fruits like apples and pears and a variety of different commercial fruits as well. Just thrown in an image there of a bat having a drink. So just for those who don't know, they dip their bellies in the water and lick the water off their fur. So quite amazing way of having a drink. You often see that around wetlands next to where they're roosting. They'll come in and feed or dip their bellies and have a drink in the evenings or before the light of day. Okay, so a while ago, back in 2010, there was a bit of an issue with, it seemed to be an issue with them in the eastern part of their range. So they seemed to be a bit of food shortages in the eastern states, and saw a lot of animals, grey-headed flying foxes moving. They were turning up on oil rigs in Bass Strait, and some made it to Tassie, and we had quite a few sites where we had colonies of bats. So that's camps, multiple bats at one location for reasonable lengths of time. And so that 2010 was really the first time that we had known camps in South Australia, one in the southeast near Mount Gambier and one up here in Adelaide. And so the food shortages over east seem to be the major driver of those broader landscape scale movements. So no tucker, they basically have to look for food, and they spread out across the country to do so. And so we had the bats find Adelaide. It was a bit of a oasis here, huge diversity of trees and planted across the city, lots of eucalypt diversity, which means there's almost a really good supply of food at any time of the year. But the other thing with the region is that there's lots of natural sources of eucalypt, different tree species in the Mount Lofty ranges, so lots of close natural bushland in proximity to the camp as well. But that the resources, basically they found the resources in 2010, and what we saw was that permanent camps established in South Australia. The camp at Botanic Park was a bit unsure whether they would establish. They succumbed to numerous heat stress events early on in their arrival in South Australia. It's the hottest part of their range here in South Australia, and those high temperatures are problematic for the species. They don't like it over that 42 degrees in particular. And so we get that not infrequently. And so that does cause impacts on the colony. And we're thinking that they might move off and because of that. But what we've quickly come to realise is that the food is the major driver here. And so that provision of that presence of a diversity of food across the landscape is the thing which is keeping the colony here. And we see that when there is a food shortage interstate, we can see a big number of animals shunt into South Australia to find food here. The thing we've seen over the last decade or so is that the camp size does really fluctuate seasonally, showing that they do run out of food and bats have to move out of the region to find food elsewhere. So we're sort of reached that point where the bats seem to be fluctuating with food resource capacity in the landscape. So when we think about bats, so when we look at the city population, their foraging does, the suggestion is that a lot of bats will try and feed within that 20-kilometre range of a camp, but then also bats can go out much further to that 50k range or even more. And so that gives you a bit of an idea of where, so bats located in Adelaide can be venturing quite a distance out into, over the ranges and out at, we have had bats recorded at Sedan and up around Port Wakefield and Victor Harbour and so on. And when we've looked a little bit further, so we've done some radio tracking work, that's where we've put some trackers. These are some examples of satellite trackers put on some 14 individuals. It shows the movements of those animals over a couple of weeks. And so what we can see from those tracks is that individuals are often going back to the same food supply each night. It can be a short distance or it can even be a long distance. They feed at those, they might be feeding at a eucalypt, which is flowering. And so that's, whilst it's flowering for weeks, they might be going back to that exact same tree. And so it's a fairly straightforward pattern. But as soon as that tree stops flowering, they'll adjust their foraging pattern to pick up another food supply. And when you look at this for those 14 individuals, if you multiply that by 40,000, that if you imagine those tracks of 40,000 individuals, that shows that a lot of the landscape is going to be pretty thoroughly covered by the bats that are out there. So there's there's a lot of bats moving across the landscape, and many people aren't aware of it, but they the main times that people hear about or notice the bats is when they're competing for a really favoured food supply. So if it's not a particularly high quality eucalypt, like it's not highly producing lots of nectar, well then they might not compete with each other for it and not squabble over it. But a resource which is really favoured, you might hear a lot more bat activity in the tree. And so that tends to be, if anyone's going to ring up, it tends to be someone ringing up over the bats, which they can hear in a lemon-scented or spotted gum, or maybe one of the big Moreton Bay figs, but it tends to be those favoured food supplies. Okay, so when you think about those movements around camps, when we think of where we're getting them in South Australia, we had quite a few notable records out in the regions in 2023. And so that's some dots out there. We had the two camps that we knew of, one at Mount Burr and one in Adelaide. But then when we look at 2024, so last year, again, it was a bit of a challenging time for flying foxes. So we noticed that they were having food shortage problems here in South Australia. And we saw a lot of expansion out into other parts of the state, even into really inhospitable areas for flying foxes. And so we saw that, lots of bats getting out into these regional centres like Yallata and Woomera, where the bats weren't surviving. So we were getting those detections via mortality events. And there's parts of the range like Port Augusta, Whyalla and Pirrie where there are camps in the landscape, but there's no way they can persist there over a summer because it just gets way too hot for them. And so whilst we see them in those areas, it's definitely going to be a seasonal thing. So yeah, just in terms of the when we see we've got foraging movements, but there are also these large movements where the bats can move hundreds of kilometres in a night. And so that we learn about this through tracking, and that tracking information is really useful because it helps us even detect new camps across the landscape, even a lot of seasonal camps that are out there. And so there's a good chance that we weren't aware of a whole range of seasonal camps out in the Riverland and up in the mid-north and even over on Eyre Peninsula. So there's a lot we can still learn. They do tend to come back to a lot of the camps regularly over the years. And so learning where they are is handy to best look after and manage conflicts and things like that might arise. So I guess that gives a bit of a snapshot of where things are with flying foxes. It's a really noticeable expansion in southeastern Australia over the last 30 to 40 years, and so what we're seeing is a continued expansion into our state, and that just so we're highly anticipating that we'll have more of these various camps across the regions, and people will be observing them like they have done in other states like Victoria and New South Wales for a long time. So yeah, that's what we're seeing here with flying foxes in South Australia. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Does anybody have a question for Jason at the moment? You can pop your hand up. See anyone with a hand up? All right. I have a question for you, Jason. If people see a flying fox outside the city areas, should they report it? And if so, how should they do that?
So that's a fantastic question. So the detection of bats out across the state is like further away from those known camp locations like Millicent and Adelaide. Those observations can be really handy because they do hint to potential colonies in the landscape or camps out there across the state. And so we're certainly keen to learn where those camps are because it's handy to understand potential issues across the region. It's good to know where they are because there's also processes like national flying fox counts which have happened in the past. And when you know where the camps are, what happens is everyone can synchronise their counts to one weekend to go to all the known camps and count the bats to get a really good population estimate. If you don't know where those camps are, you can miss large percentages of the population. So all those little clues that come in from the community around, we've seen bats out here during this winter period, or it can really help identify where additional camps might be and where searching needs to happen.
So would they put them on something like iNaturalist?
Perfect. iNaturalist is perfect. Yeah. So that's a great thing.
Take a picture.
You can do the record the calls. They've got a very distinctive call. So if you're hearing them feeding in trees, or if you happen to get a photo, lucky enough to get a photo, that's great. But certainly whack them in something like iNat is awesome.
All right, we've got questions coming in now. All right, Kyle, I think you were next, and we've got one coming on the chat too.
Thanks, Jason. How do you think they deal with WOMAD? Do they do okay?
They do exceptionally well. So the when I say exceptionally well, it's challenging. The WOMAD team recognise the significance of the colony. They go to quite extraordinary lengths to try and minimise the disturbance impacts on those bats. So what they do is they move their equipment in after the bats have left out to forage at night. So they're setting up during the night to avoid that disturbance of knocking in droppers and things like that when the bats are around, which is a really important thing. They also have set up sort of zones to where they have the performances, and they shut down zones or can shut down zones if there's concerns around bats and the heat and they need to get the sprinklers on to cool them down, all that sort of stuff. They adjust the whole event to suit the flying foxes there. So it is a really good example of how you can have significant events, and the fact that the bats are still there is a bit of a testament to how the team are working with the colony. Because if you if you didn't meet the requirements of flying foxes, like setting up at night, that colony wouldn't be there. It would be scared out of there, and it would be down the Torrens or somewhere. Like, it would be displaced from that site. So the fact that they've been able to roll out WOMAD year after year and still have the bats there is a really good testament to paying attention to the needs of that population. And the other thing that amazes me is when you go there and there's a band playing underneath and the bats are just snoozing and chilling out above the music, and it's just hard to believe that they're that chilled around all that activity. But
yeah, I like the music.
They seem to, but it's even interesting because that all the WOMAD and fringe event stuff, you go into the East Parklands and the youngsters are often, so the youngsters, when it's around the time youngsters are starting to move out from the camp, and youngsters are just going to other parts of the fringe and hanging out above other shows and things, and it's like not going to the quieter parts of the landscape. They're going to hustling, bustling parts of the landscape, and you can hear all the chatter of these bats, and it's these youngsters which are just moving around. They're on their L's with flights and just doing these short flights and just chilling out in the same sort of settings.
So maybe they won't move out into the bush because it's too quiet for them.
Well, I think that the thing is the tucker with them. They definitely, I think their bellies drive them all over the state. So, yep, I think they'll get there.
All right. Yeah, we better get to some more questions now. Nina, you've got your hand up. Do you want to ask a question?
Hi, Jason. Yeah, thank you. I just want to know, this camp at Whyalla, is that just a one-off event that's happened, or are you seeing them there more regularly?
So the Whyalla, there were quite a few records at Whyalla, and the thing we find out in multiple ways. So we get observations, but we also we work closely with SA Power Networks, and they also, and the carers, and they're often dealing with electrocutions and things like that, where bats are getting into different areas and getting to trouble on power lines. And so we hear that there's multiple, there might be some sightings, there might be incidents with the bats on power lines, but we also, for the Whyalla site, we understand that someone was chopping a pine tree down, and lots of bats flew out, and that is highly likely where that camp was. So,
Okay.
we're not confident that there will be another necessarily the camp at the same spot, given that locality, which was a pine tree that they tend to like them as camps.
Yeah.
So, yep.
Okay. And just roughly, like, what's their sort of average flight height? Do you have any data on, when they're sort of moving about, not necessarily maybe foraging, but just expanding their range a bit? Do they fly quite high in the sky, or are they sort of low?
It's hard. So one of the things that seems to happen, and so I've noticed it, is if they're trying to do it, if they're heading somewhere into the wind, then they tend to fly low. But if they are moving somewhere with the wind, you can see it on occasion where they'll spiral up at the camp, go circle up higher, and use the wind to help move them along in a sort of in the direction they want to go. So it tends to be there seems to be a bit of variation, but I've heard that that's some of their strategy. Go low if it's into the wind, go higher if you've got a tailwind. So
like 200 or higher or lower? Do you have any idea?
I'd have to have a look at some of that. So the satellite tracking data is really useful because often it gives elevation as well. And so, but it's certainly in that 100-metre range, definitely up that high. Yep.
Great. Awesome. Thank you very much.
No worries.
I've just got a couple more questions quickly here that have come in the chat. Someone also wanting to know about power lines. Has the GPS tracker study improved understanding of flight patterns and assisted in deploying line protection measures more effectively?
So the satellite tracker stuff, so we've basically looked at adults, and so the adults aren't the ones predominantly coming into grief. So there are situations where trees growing through power lines where there's a nectar source do cause problems, where they're coming into that food supply. But a big pulse of the outages relates to those youngsters who are basically on their L's, and they get into strife in the just when they're dispersing from starting to do those flights out from the camp. So the February, March, April type period, that's when we see a pulse in the outages caused by juveniles. But so what the carers and SA Power Networks are doing are looking at all those that outage data and using that information to home in and get those frisbees on the power lines to protect the bats from those outages, to prevent outages. And so they're using that information. And the problem is with tracking data, it's a very short-term thing, and the resources that they're using. So, for example, if you go to the camp at this period, you might see a strong stream of bats out, say, north towards Gawler, where they're funneling out through a large number seem to be funneling out north. But then a few months later, it could be a really strong stream of bats funneling south. And so whenever you take a bit of information, it's sort of like a snapshot and things that it's very dynamic. So you have to, be aware that some of the snapshots aren't reflective of, and they're often only a few bats in a sea of thousands of bats that are being looked at as well.
As you said, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, once a camp is established, do they stay all year or do they migrate with seasonal changes?
Good question. So there are a definite seasonal camps. So there's a cool camp in at a place near Robe. It's basically in a pine forest, and it's seasonal when there's hardly any ute diversity in that area, but when the red gums in that area flower, there's quite a few red gums in the area. It's this Wongalina area, and they rock up, and you have a camp of flying foxes which are utilising that red gums food supply. But as soon as that supply runs out, they don't have a choice. There's nothing else for them. They have to move on. So that's where Adelaide sort of ends up, and a lot of the cities tend to have these permanent camps, which are reasonable in size, because the diversity of tree species in a city is huge compared to some of the even bushland areas. So what you find in some of the true bushland areas is that when you have a blue gum woodland or a red gum woodland, or those major woodlands flowering, then they can capitalise on those resources if they are a good food supply. But as soon as if there's nothing else, once they finish up, then they have to generally move out of the area. And so it's a very cool strategy when you think of it nationally, that they can shunt around the country. The big fires in Victoria and New South Wales resulted in a huge number of bats pushing into southeast Queensland. They had camps of close by of 150,000 in each camp. They hadn't had numbers like that at all. And we could even expect that down the track. If there is a big problem on the East Coast, then a lot could shunt into South Australia if the food's here. And you might have these pulses while they're trying to get through a shortage. But again, the pulses can only last while the food's there. And so it's they can't they can't just stick around if there isn't a supply. And we're seeing that fluctuation in Adelaide. So we even know that 40,000 is too much at times, even for Adelaide.
And the last one, what is a baby bat called? Do you know the answer to that one? Or
Pups.
Pups. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that makes the flying fox pups. That's what they refer to. But yeah, I'm not sure. Kyle will be able to sort out.
Maybe we'll get Kyle to answer that for the microbats.
Yep.
All right. Thank you very much, Jason.
No worries.
And now we'll head over to Kyle to learn about the microbats.
Yep. So I think about bats every day, and I guess on World Bat Appreciation Day, it's great to have everyone else thinking about bats too. This will be some stories about bats in South Australia, and you can see from my little cartoon here that bats have ecologically keystone roles. They play a great role in insect suppression, not only in agricultural systems for pest insects, but also in natural systems as well. And I'm really interested in bat skulls, because if you look at any bat skull, you can find out what it does, where it feeds, what it eats, a little bit about where it might live. And you can see that every single bat species or skull here has its own unique shapes, which means that each bat species has its own 60 million year old story of how it got to be the way it is and how it functions in its environment. And so I guess I've only got 15 minutes, so the hardest thing about giving a bat talk is actually to tell you so much about bats, but I'll just single out a couple of these species. If you look at the one in the top left with the big bumpy bit on the front, that's a species that emits its biosonar or echolocation through the nose, and that bumpy bit helps get the really loud signal from the tiny space inside the bat to the outside environment. And then there's another species there, A, which has a really heavy jaw and this pokey uppy thing at the back of its head. That bat eats hard-shelled beetles, and that heavy jaw is just the thing for smashing through the tough beetles. And the top of the head of the bat contains a big muscle which is attached to that crest on the top of its head, and the muscle swings up that heavy jaw. If you look at D, that's actually the skull of the vampire bat, and you can see that it doesn't have many teeth at all, but it does have those really sharp teeth which it uses to pierce the skin of mammals. And actually, while we're on the subject of vampire bats, there are only 3 in the world. There's the one that feeds on the blood of mammals, which is Desmodus, but there are 2 other species in a different genus that specialize in feeding on the blood of birds. And if we just go over to the other side, you'll see a really flat-looking bat called L. With the letter L next to it. That's the bamboo bat, and you can go to actually the Singapore Botanic Gardens, and you'll see splits in bamboo in the garden there, and probably in some of those splits you'll see, well, you might be able to find, or you won't be able to find them, but inside might be these bamboo bats that sort of sneak in through the little splits in the bamboo. So they're very flat bats. So, so many stories, but we'll have to move on. So this is what a bat looks like with all the outer bits removed, and you can see obviously that the wings are made up of elongated arms and fingers as well. And if we compare bats to birds and flying dinosaurs, you'll notice that the structure of the wing is different, which indicates that flight arose at least 3 times in evolutionary history. And you can see that it arose, in different ways. So bats have their fingers as wings. Birds have very little development of fingers, but the wing is mostly its arm. And flying dinosaurs actually just had wings made of their little fingers. So that's kind of a bit weird as well as remarkable at the same time. And if we happen to catch a whole bunch of bats and we sticky tape them to a piece of board and then we trace around their wings, you can see that each bat species has a different shaped wing. And those wings give it some level of agility and speed, which relates to their ecological niche, where they fly in the environment and how they capture their food. And so on this particular example, which comes from Lombok in Indonesia, you can see that there are small bats. Some of them have sort of short, broad wings, such as Hipposidrus ater on the right there. And then on the other side, Cheraphon plicata has really narrow, long wings, which are good for high speed maneuvers above treetops and everything in between. And so as scientists, we love to measure things. So if we go from 1, 2, 3 on the 3 plots here, you can see that if you measure just a couple of things like wing loading and aspect ratio, so wing loading is how heavy the bat is compared to how big its wings are, and aspect ratio is how pointy its wings are, you can see that you can actually separate the different species, which are indicated by the little 2-letter acronyms on each cross. But you can also divide those species up into where they actually fly in the environment, so their flight space. So OC, for example, is over canopy, and if we look at the opposite end, We see there's a species there, NG, which is a long-eared bat, and its flight space is IS, which is inside stands of vegetation, and everything in between. So just from 2 measurements, we can characterize the not only the shape of the wings, but where bats fly. And you can also get other measurements, of course. You can calculate these things called E bar and V bar, which are measurements or allow us to understand how agile bats are. So some bats are more agile than others, and you might imagine that if you're going to fly around trees, you need to be more agile than bats that fly over the tops of trees in straight lines. And if we keep going, we can think about how bats actually capture their prey, and you can measure things on the tail, the length ratio and the area ratio. And again, you can split species up into little groups, and you can understand that some groups capture their insect prey in different ways. So interceptors basically fly faster than the bug, and they sort of pick it up on the way as they fly through, as they're flying in fast straight lines. Whereas air superiority bats kind of outfly and outmaneuver their insect prey amongst the leaves of vegetation, but in the open. And then surface gleaning bats on the right there, they pick out insects from the surfaces of leaves, and they can use their echolocation or their biosonar to pick up the texture and the shape of bugs that might be sitting and flapping away on leaves, for example. So here we've got 6 measurements which completely characterize how bats fly and how well they fly, and how they actually capture their bug lunches in all different ways. And each way is different for each species. So each species has its own ecological niche. So yeah, what a great story. And here's all that scientific kerfuffle in just summarized in one nice picture. You can see one bat over the top there of the forest, which is flying in straight lines in open spaces. And then there are a couple of bats, numbers 2 and 3, which fly above and around canopy. Bat type number 4 flies around within the underneath the canopy throughout the understory of forests. And then down the bottom you can see number 5 type bat, which is one we'll see a picture of later. That's a bat that gleans both insects and fish from the surface of streams. So how do they find their prey? Well, you've heard me mention biosonar, and you all probably know that bats emit echolocation calls. Each species pretty much emits a distinct echolocation call type. So much like birds have their own calls, so too do bats. And here's a selection from South Australia. Bats basically emit their echolocation as pulses, just like submarines. They emit pings, but they have different shaped pings. You can see, and I've kind of, scrunched up their echolocation sequences into little groups so we can see them better. But you can see that all the pulses are at different frequencies. So if you look at on the side there, you'll see that the first bat species A, which is the white-striped free-tailed bat, it's calling at about 10 kilohertz, and we can hear that bat because most people can hear up to about 10 kilohertz and a little bit beyond. But if you go to the next highest frequency bat, which is B here, which is a species of Aussie mops or free-tailed bat, it's a bit out of our hearing range. And so on. You can see that the pulse shape is different for each bat species, and its frequency range is also different. And I guess I could talk for hours about this stuff because I spend a lot of my day thinking about bat biosonar as well. But the nice thing is that when we do surveys, we can put out recorders that can record the ultrasonic sounds of bats, and then we can take them back and analyze them on the computer. Maisie might be able to tell you a few stories about that kind of thing because she did her honours on bat calls in the arid parts of South Australia. So here's a little video just to show you that bats use their echolocation calls to both avoid objects and also find their prey. And they do that simultaneously, and they do it in the dark, and they do it without looking at things, and they do it all at high speed. So here we go. Hopefully this will work. So the bat's going, what's in front of me and are there any bugs? Oh, it's seen something in its way, needs a bit more information. Oh, now it's seen a bug or a worm in this case. It wants to know everything about that worm. Is it tasty? Is it going to poison me? Where exactly is it? Okay, what's next? So that's a great study that was done in the US. So how many bats in South Australia? There's about 27 by my count. And if you go to, if you Google ABS bat map, you'll get this wonderful resource from the Australasian Bat Society. And you can look up the distribution that's been carefully curated by Australia's bat experts, and we can see the distribution of each bat species. Because I'm a biologist, I love to look for patterns. So I look at distribution maps quite a lot. And if we look at the distribution maps of South Australian bats, you can kind of group them into, well, groups, I suppose. There are the species that are quite common and widespread. There are species that are found mainly over southern areas of Australia. There are species that kind of sneak into South Australia via the Murray River. And then if you look a little bit more to the right, you can see that other species of bat are sneaking in not via the river, but along the coast. And I guess the grey-headed flying fox that Jason talked about previously is one of those species that doesn't come down the river, but actually comes from places like Narracourt and then comes further up the coast to Adelaide City. Another species of flying fox, the little red flying fox, is a vagrant in South Australia. So there are just a few records of it, which are indicated by the dots, the black dots in that vagrant map there. The poor old ghost bat used to be in South Australia, but it's now been extirpated. Well, we don't really understand why, but it used to exist in some places in Central Australia, and there are subfossil remains in the Flinders Ranges as well. There are a few species that are adapted to arid zone habitats. That means they're adapted to certain kinds of rainfall regimes, certain types of vegetation community, heat, and also fire regimes as well. So their ecology is basically in sync with arid zone environments. And I have to move this so I can see what's underneath. And then on the last group on the right there's a whole bunch of bats that are found mainly in other states, but they just kind of sneak into South Australia and they add to the tally here. Oops. Okay, so the unfortunate news is that almost half of those 27 species are listed as either endangered or vulnerable or rare under our state legislation, the National Parks and Wildlife Act of 1972. So all bats all bat species in South Australia are native and they're all protected, but some are more especially protected than others, and we need to pay them special attention, especially when developers might be proposing to have a new project, a new development project assessed for its impact on all sorts of different species, but including some of these specially listed bats. So why are they listed as endangered or vulnerable or rare? I guess the rare species are here only because, are listed only because they just make it into South Australia and they're not found very often. But some species, sorry, I'm having trouble moving to the next slide, are listed because they're actually subject to various key threats. Obviously, in South Australia, there's been a lot of historical broad-scale clearing for agriculture, but it's also ongoing. But the vegetation remnants that are left are also subject to inappropriate burning regimes sometimes, or burning is conducted too frequently, and that's often because of natural causes such as lightning, but also because people sometimes burn things. And that's a problem because one of the resources that bats find in vegetation remnants and elsewhere are hollows that they roost in during the day. And apart from the flying foxes, all of South Australia's bats roost in either tree hollows or under bark or amongst foliage, mainly under bark and within tree hollows. And so burning removes those tree hollows, and those hollows in trees can take decades to form. So if we burn too often, then we lose that resource for bats. Everyone's aware of the possibility of drying out of South Australia because of climate change, and related to that are the extreme heat events that have a great toll on especially young flying foxes here in Adelaide as well. Those heat events have always been around, but they're more frequent with climate change. And there's been a lot of work done on this, especially on the East Coast. And I guess it's quite topical now in the news to hear about wind farm projects, and there are many wind farms or wind energy projects that are proposed all across Australia. But what we're finding is that we don't really know enough. We don't understand enough about how bats might be impacted. That includes threatened species such as bent-wing bats, but also high-flying species such as white-striped free-tailed bats. And we also don't understand much about bats that might fly normally at low levels, but change their behaviour when there's tall infrastructure all of a sudden appearing in their environment. So there's been some papers written about how bats might actually start to fly up new novel structures in their environment. And there's evidence that some of those species that even fly within vegetation are impacted by wind turbines. So we need to understand the risks to bats much more. So I'll end my talk by just going through the main groups of bats in South Australia and picking out one or two amazing things about South Australian bats. So I guess here are some pups of grey-headed flying foxes, and I think the most amazing thing about flying foxes, especially if you were listening, if you listen to Jason's story and how far bats range, I'm always amazed at how bats can stream out of the Botanic Gardens every night and go tens of kilometres and find something to eat in the dark. Many, many kilometres away. They don't get in their car during the day and go and scope places out. They actually go and find out these places in the dark. And Adelaide is supporting up to 50,000 individuals of these bats, and they fly out every night and find food somewhere in the dark. I think that's just incredible. Here's two different families of bats, the sheath-tailed bats and the ghost bat in the Megadermatidae. We'll start with the ghost bat because it just looks totally amazing. I've worked on this species a bit over the years in different places in Australia, but apart from its remarkable appearance, it's carnivorous, so it likes budgies. It likes little honey eaters. It eats lizards, dunarts, and really big grasshoppers. And it's an efficient carnivore because you can see it has excellent eyesight, excellent hearing, and it has all these little structures on its face to help project echolocation and hear the very soft echoes that come back from things in its environment, but also the little peeps and rustles that potential prey items make as they're getting around the bush in the dark. So yeah, a fantastic species to have in Australia. Sheath-tailed bats come in kind of two main flavours. There's the Sacalamus genus, which tend to roost in trees, and then there's the Taphozous genus, and they all, except maybe one in the Northern Territory, they all tend to roost in caves. And one of the remarkable things about these two groups of bats is they have terrific sight fidelity. So they can fly out and range tens of kilometres and find food and then fly back every night and find the same cave or the same little tree hollow that they came out of 10 hours ago. And I think that's a remarkable thing. So the next few groups kind of all look the same. They're little brown jobbies, all about the same size. But here's a group, the wattled bats. There's Gould's wattled bat, the chalky wattled bats, the little pied bat, to name just three of, I think, 4 species of wattled bats in South Australia. And if you look really closely at the example in the top left, you can see there's a little bit of a flappy bit on the corner of its mouth. Basically, that's its wattle. But the wattle is there, well, it's not there when the bat opens its mouth, and you can see that each of these bats is flying and emitting echolocation pulses, and that wattle kind of expands into this lovely parabolic shape, which helps the bat project those echolocation pulses out in front of it as it flies around in the dark. And you can see that they come in different flavors. The chocolate bat in the middle is looks caramel flavored there. The little pie bat is an extremely beautiful bat. It has this beautiful velvety dark fur, and then some white fringing fur to the side and below. And Gould's wattle bat is one of the most common bats in Australia, but it's also quite a nice looking bat. It has sort of a light colour underneath and then a darker head, so they're quite easy to identify when you catch them in traps. Broad-nosed bats, I find these interesting mainly because of some research that I did recently. There are 4 described species of broad-nosed bat in Australia, and a 5th species that's undescribed but hasn't really been confirmed yet. But with a couple of other people, we did some genetic work after we thought we might have found a new species in the Gulf country, way up near the Gulf of Carpentaria. We did some genetic work, and we think that there actually might be at least 6 or 7 species. So they kind of look similar. They're all a brown, light-coloured brown. But if you look at their faces, you can see some differences sometimes, but they all have this very broad nose, which is why they're called the broad-nosed bat. Forest bats. This is a very interesting genus, and I've got a PhD student, Fabian Saucelli, who's working on this group at the moment. In this genus Vespidilus, there are 9 species, or at least 9 species. Fabian might find some more. But basically, there's 2 groups. Again, there's all of the species that are in northern Australia, in the arid areas and the monsoonal tropics, and they all live in caves. And then if you come to the southern half of Australia, there's about 5 species, and they all roost in trees. And they all fly around in the open and capture insects around vegetation, but in the open, much like the broad-nosed bats as well. And I remember my first Falcistrel. Falcistrels are like these forest bats, but they're kind of double the size. And I remember seeing my first Falcistrel and going, "Oh, what a whopper!" They're beautifully chocolatey brown coloured bats that also forage around vegetation, but in sort of the open spaces. The whispering bats, or the long-eared bats, have these really long ears. When they're resting, they can fold those up into little crinkly-looking things on the top of their head. But when they're flying around, you can see that their ears are fully extended, and that's for listening to the echoes of insects that might be sitting and fluttering either in the open, in the air, or on the surface of leaves. And so they emit calls that are very broadband, which means that they sweep from really high frequencies to really low frequencies. And that's kind of akin to colour, where we think about colour as existing, or we see colour in a range of frequencies from purple at one end to sort of red at the other. And if we try and get our heads around what bats are doing, sweeping through a range of sound frequencies, it's kind of analogous to that, but we can't really understand it. But maybe the way I understand it is they're seeing different textures, I suppose. So that's how they're seeing insects as little textural blobs out there on things. It'd be great to have just an inkling of what they think sometimes, I reckon. We're coming to the end, but I think one of the most remarkable bats in South Australia is the fishing bat. You can see that this one's actually caught a fish. They also feed on insects on the top of streams and rivers, and also the River Murray. But the thing to notice about this little fluffy is its enormous feet, which it uses to scrape up those insects from the surface of streams and rivers. And this isn't a behaviour that's limited to just Australian Myotis bats. There are fishing bats in Europe and Asia and the Palearctic as well. So it's quite a remarkable thing. And the last group are the free-tailed bats. They're in their own family. They tend to fly over and around tree canopy. The white-striped free-tailed bat you can hear chipping away, especially in the summer, above the treetops. People think they're crickets or something, But if you hear this regular chip, 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 chip noise, it's probably a white-striped free-tail bats, and they'll be flying quite high, maybe tens of meters up in the air over the canopy. And then the Aussie mops, which are all the other little ones that I've illustrated here. I think there's 4 species of Aussie mops in South Australia. They all sort of fly around and over the tree canopy, and they all they're extremely cute little bats. But you can see the bristle-faced bat there. It has like a little moustache underneath its nose on its lips there. That's probably for characterizing and manipulating or understanding what kind of prey it's captured as well. And I think that's probably enough from me. I'll just leave this last slide. There's a lot of research that goes on bats in South Australia, on South Australian bats and bats elsewhere. And this is just a list of my students, but there are also other students in other universities in South Australia that are studying bats as well. I think Maddie might be joining in tonight as well. But they've been studying taxonomy of bent-wing bats in Australasia, the conservation of bats in Fiji, some Australian bats. I mentioned Fabian before. Maisie's here, and she studied arid bats and how they've recovered after release from grazing pressure on Bon Bon Station and Bulkamata. And you might have heard previously from Harry Rust, who looked at the response of urbanisation, or response of bats to urbanisation in Adelaide. And now we're actually getting into the effect of wind farms and using machine learning tools to understand what bats are doing and how they're separating themselves in South Australia and elsewhere. So that's probably enough from me. Gosh, there's so much more to talk about, but I'll leave it there. Thanks.
As you can see, Carl really appreciates bats, but we're going to have to cut you off there.
Sorry.
I'll just quickly go through my little bit, and then we'll have some question time for Kyle at the end. If you're happy to stay on for a little bit after 8:30, if that's all right with everyone. But mine won't take very long. I'll just share mine. So just a quick little recap of a citizen science project that we ran about 6 years ago now, the Mega Murray-Darling microbat project, because there wasn't a lot of information about the bats in this area of South Australia, or in any area of South Australia, but this was the main area that we were working in. So we decided to get everyone involved. And we did that by getting together a super bat team from people from Landcare, universities, and us from the Murraylands and Riverland Landscape Board. And we lent out Anabat recorders, and we put out the bat call through the Landcare Project Officer Network. And we got people to come and borrow these Anabats and provide us some information on the type of habitat they were putting them in, do the recording, send it back in. They'd send us in the photos of the habitat and the other information. We'd get the calls analysed and tell them which species they got. And they got to learn about the bats around them and also what they could do to help improve the bat habitat that they supported on their own properties. So what did we manage to do in those 2 years? So this is 2017 to 2019. Well, prior to this project, there were 2,800 records for this area of South Australia. And in those 2 years, we managed to get over 3,000 new microbat records. So just in 2 years, it was pretty amazing. And what did we find? So there was a species richness of at least 11 species that we found in this area. And the habitats that seemed to support the highest number of species were woodlands, tall forests, and also areas with water like the River Murray. But the really exciting bit was also that even urban backyards and farmland that didn't necessarily look like it was amazing habitat also had an average of at least 4 microbat species. So bats are living around all of us. And this is some pretty cool stuff as well. For example, the fishing bat that Kyle just talked to us about, we managed to get 4 new records of this threatened species. There'd only been 2 known populations of this species in South Australia prior to this. We got 4 new records, and that was from someone taking a houseboat down the river and recording as they went. It's pretty amazing. And this is a new project we're just doing. This is in the Marne and Saunders catchment, which is Eden Valley down to Cambrai, Cainton, those kind of areas. And what we're doing in this catchment is trying to get as much information together as we can to give us an indicator of the health year on year. And so to do that, we need something that's collected annually. So at the moment, the bats can't be included in this, but we are now starting this from this year, trying to collect information from these bats annually to see what's going on with them, because we know they're connected with the habitat, and this is very much a drying catchment here, and with the water resources. So this is just very preliminary at the moment. But we've managed to get quite a few landholders involved, so more in that area than were actually involved previously in the previous project. And we've done more recording nights, but interestingly, and this is very, very preliminary, we can't really say much at all, we've got less species recorded now than there was when we did it 6 years ago. But we're going to keep going, and we'll keep doing it year on year and see what the bats are up to. So what else can you do? Well, there's lots of things you can do around your place. Keep your cats in, and definitely keep cats in at night. You can put bat boxes up at your place. Looking out for light pollution, particularly at night, is a bit of an issue. Protect any hollows that you've got. That's one of the most important things you can do. Not using too many insecticides, because obviously the insects are what the bats eat. And also having a nice diverse native habitat on your property and clean water resources as well. So there's an awful lot of things that you can do around your place. So that's it from me, and we're pretty close to the end. But if people are happy, so I'll just say thank you all for joining us and showing your appreciation. And if you're happy to hang around for a few more minutes, and you can ask Kyle or Jason or me or Maisie any extra questions. Anyone got any questions for Kyle? I think you told them everything, Kyle.
Not everything.
Oh, Jason's got his hand up.
Kyle, do you know how to stop bats eating moths?
How to stop bats eating moths?
It's just a question. I've been looking at some of the moth diversity. I noticed that when I'm out looking at moths, the bats are getting out there, and they're so good at catching them. It's just amazing to see that their agility, and it reminded me of a study that was done looking at microbats in winery areas where they did a diet analysis, and the amazing thing that come from that was that the bats were eating a whole range of species that really weren't even moth species that weren't even detected in South Australia before, and so it was a great way to sample. But it was just a question that just basically saying that they're just amazing to watch them chasing things down at night.
You're not saying that the moths are more important than the bats, though, Jason. I mean,
Well,
moths are amazing.
Yeah.
Certainly, I think bats really like moths. Bats most commonly eat dipterans like flies and those sorts of things, or night or related things that fly at night, but also moths as well, and beetles. I reckon maybe we should think about how we can make more moths. So a good way to make moths is to plant more plants, and then hopefully there'll be some water to make the plants grow. More plants is more bugs. More bugs is a more richer ecosystem. And if we have a richer ecosystem, we can easily, or it's fairly straightforward to measure how rich that ecosystem is, because we can put bat detectors out and see how many bats are around eating all the moths. So,
yep, sounds like a plan.
Yeah,
that's a better idea. Have them both.
We just make more.
We have make more of all of it. Okay, we have a question here about the stigma on bats as disease carriers. What's the risk in South Australia with these bat-borne diseases? Did you want to?
Well, I don't know if Jason you might be better to comment, at least initially, given that most of the risk is with flying foxes, or?
Sure. Yeah, so obviously there has been a bit of awareness raising having the flying fox colonies here in South Australia. It's just a bit of a novel thing, and so it's just a big thing has been communicating with everyone just not to touch the flying foxes. A very, very small percentage can have lyssavirus, and so it's really important that if people are scratched or bitten, that they take the right precautions and get a treatment for it. So anyone handling bats regularly, there is that, having a lyssavirus, a rabies shot is considered a really useful thing. But there's that message, shouldn't be touching or handling bats unless you're being vaccinated and you're doing it appropriately. In terms of the things like Hendra virus, there's that virus has really been concentrated to a fairly small area. There has been, I think, a detection of a bat with Hendra virus in the state, but the virus seems to be need to go through another host, so it goes from bats to horses and then gets amplified in horses, and then there's a risk. But where it's doing that is really in a very small part of the country, and it seems to be associated with I think the latest is that it's the black flying foxes as opposed to the grey-headed. So, but yeah, just so people there's a vaccine for Hendra and horses now, so there's even precautions that can be taken there. So people are worried about the risk to a horse. So yeah, it's just a matter of just not, just being careful. They're wild animals. They'll try and protect themselves. There's a slight risk that one has a virus, but because of that slight risk, you have to treat it as if every bat has the virus, basically. So yeah, it's just a really important thing to react seriously to a scratch or a bite and get it checked out.
Thank you. Have we got any other questions?
I think Sasha in the chat asked, when is the mating season?
Thanks, Maisie.
I can
Kyle?
I can give a brief answer for the insectivorous bats. So as with the ecology of a lot of animals, like birds are a good example as well, or a comparator. Bats start to mate in the winter season and then gestate for several months and then give birth at a time when there's most resources that support lactation. So that will be towards the end of the year. A lot of my work is done in Northern Australia, so I'm used to thinking about tropical systems. And one surprise that we sort of came across in the last few years is that Pilbara leaf-nosed bats, for example, might actually breed more than once. So we've got some idea, or at different times at least. And so there might not be a strictly defined breeding season. It might be dependent on weather patterns and differences in years according to El Nino and things like that. There's still lots that we don't understand, but basically, yeah, the short answer is that they give birth towards the end of the year, December, January, sometime, and then there's plenty of resources around for mummy bats to make lots of milk to feed the babies.
And just with the flying foxes, the greyheads tend to have a mating period in around late summer, early autumn, and then they sort of pup in spring, grow those youngsters over in up and towards that Christmas period. When they start get too big, they get crached, and the adults leave the pups in a creche and fly out and do the foraging and come back and feed them. And then they're sort of heading out on their own in in the February, sort of March, starting to do those short flights away. But there is a bit of a variation. So there's been some noticeable variation where there seem like you might have different cohorts of age groups, and some of that may relate to females coming in from a different part of the country which have youngsters at different stages. So yeah, that's the general pattern that seems to be observed.
Thank you. And Nina's got a question again?
Yeah, hi Kyle. You mentioned that the sheath-tailed bats have high sight fidelity. So obviously land clearance would be a big issue for them. I mean, all bats obviously, but do you know how disruptive that is for them? I guess it's $1 million question, but if you cut down their tree with a hollow in it, are they going to succumb to the elements or predators like during the day because they can't find somewhere, or do they fairly readily just kind of find any kind of crevice they can crawl into and look for something the next night?
Yeah, good question. I'm going to take a guess, but it's based on lots of observations. I think they'd probably kind of be okay, at least initially, because they've lost their home and they need to find a new home that has that supports their social structure, because they roost together in little groups, and those groups are involved in breeding and all those things. But say a bat comes back and finds that its home's gone because someone's tipped it over, then both the Sacalamus and the Taphozous that I mentioned or illustrated, they're both quite resilient in terms of environmental conditions. So if they find some other little crack, they'll probably be, if they choose wisely, I suppose, they'll probably be okay during the day until they can fly out again and search for another home. The reason I think that is because the cave roosting bats especially, they roost in the twilight areas of caves. So those areas at the front of the cave are usually cooler than just outside in the sun, obviously, but they're not so different from ambient temperatures outside the cave. So they don't have a physiology that's like some of the other cave bats that roost deeper into the structure, like ghost bats and pilbara leaf-nosed bats and some other leaf-nosed bats and horseshoe bats, bent-wing bats. They all require dark areas of caves with humid, stable, warm conditions generally. But the sheath-tailed bats are a little bit more resilient, and they're a larger, more robust bat than some of these other little things as well. Yep.
Great, thank you.
I muted myself. Maisie, have I missed any other questions that have come in?
I think that's all of them covered, yeah.
Right, excellent. Well, sorry we've gone a little bit over time, everybody. There's just too much to appreciate about bats. But thank you so much for joining us on this night just before the extra big long weekend. Yeah, I hope you appreciate bats even a little bit more now and think about how you can show that appreciation in your lives every day. So thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks, everyone.